Hello, this is Val Webb speaking to you from Mudgee again today. This presentation is going to amble through many topics that have come to my mind with the title, The View from Where I Stand Today. This suggests that I'm somewhere I wasn't in the past, which of course is the essence of process theology, that everything is changing and becoming in every moment, and God is an integral part of all that change. Now at this point, I should stop and explain what I mean by God, but I'll do that later. Where I stand today involves a lifetime of change within myself, but also in those around me and in the context in which I live. And we've a term for that too, contextual theology, meaning that theology cannot simply be the unchanging doctrines from the past, but has to result from our reflection on our particular context in the present. Feminist and liberation theologies have shown how delusional the assumption is that what was written by men in monasteries in medieval times is applicable for all centuries, all experiences, and all genders. And when we talk of context, we have another new word, intersectionality, reminding us that a person cannot be explained by only one or two features of their context. So many things combine, overlap, and intersect to make a person. Being a woman, for example, doesn't explain the whole of a person. She can also be poor, oppressed, indigenous, less educated, all these adding to her disadvantage, hence the term intersectionality. Womanist and Asian feminist theologies emerged when Black women and Asian women realised that although they were women, their experiences were different from the white, educated university women, and that impacted also on who they were. It's good to reflect on all that's made us us. We have been prone in the past to ignore or deny some aspects of our lives, thinking them of no consequence to the I that we are now. For example, we used to talk about the self-made man, someone from a non-privileged background who worked himself into a position of power, status, and wealth, supposedly without anyone's help. We bought into this myth, overlooking the women, the mother, teacher, wife, who nurtured him as a baby, educated him, and created a home and family for him to succeed, together with the many mentors and circumstances that fortuitously changed his life at various stages. In the same way, families once hid sexual abuse of children by relatives, teachers, and friends, seeing it as unfortunate, but something from which we could move on. We now know how such abuse shapes a victim forever, ruining their ability to trust, to form relationships, and to thrive. All aspects of our past affect the context and mindset in which we live and act today. Doing my own reflection, there are many influences on the view from where I stand today. I'm closer to 80 than 75. I'm a woman, a spouse, a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. I'm a theologian, a little frustrated not to be still in the thick of it all, as the brain does not simply stop thinking on account of age. I'm an author, and authors always have another book in them, waiting to emerge. I feel a loneliness at the loss of my blood family. My parents are dead, and my only sibling is lost in the fog of Alzheimer's. I'm conscious now that I alone hold the Skirman family memories in my heart and in my head, but also literally in boxes of inherited diaries and papers that need to be shaped into a family history. I'm an artist who owned an art gallery in the 70s, and my yearning to take it up again has, during COVID, morphed into transforming a spare bedroom into a studio. I'm a Uniting Church member, and I write Christian on official papers that require such things. But both these terms need explanation and deconstruction later in this presentation. All this intersectionality, our new word, impacts who I am today. Religion's an important influencer in our lives, whether we had it or whether we didn't. Many in progressive groups today had evangelical, Catholic or fundamentalist childhood, or else they had conversion experiences as teenagers and young adults and have needed to deconstruct these, which in some cases have been abusive. This is why I often call progressive Christianity remedial Christianity. Some people can simply walk away from unhelpful childhood theologies, but for others, every part of their being has been so long infused with certain teachings that no matter how much our minds might reject these ideas, they can never quite remove this shadow from our lives. I fall into this category because so much of who I am was shaped by early religious experiences. As those who've read my books know, I was a child of a wonderful evangelical Christian family whose defining values were religion and education. My father taught at the university, and my mother was removed from school at 15 to her eternal regret, while her brothers went on to university. So education was a priority for both of them. Our church affiliation was Presbyterian, but the family theology was shaped more by the Crusader ISCF movement, by Billy Graham, and the university's Evangelical Union. From a child, I was obsessed with God and in love with Jesus. Instead of pop stars, I had Salmon's Head of Christ picture hanging at eye level above my study desk. You know that one, the yellow-brown half-profile picture of a handsome Caucasian Christ with long flowing hair. I yearned for dramatic spiritual experiences as proof that I belonged to God, a voice, a vision, a feeling. But this unfulfilled longing also became the beginning of my struggle with doubt. Does God exist? Is the Bible true? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? These were life and death questions because wrong belief was going to land me into hell. And since my childhood Christianity shunned dancing and any place where alcohol might lurk, such lifestyle sacrifices had better be for nothing. Had better not be for nothing. I could spot inconsistencies in dogmas, but no one else seemed to be concerned. Or if they were, they suppressed their doubts as successfully as I did. At university, our religious group offered watertight arguments for everything. And doubt was never seen as an act of intelligence, as it was in chemistry and biology I was studying, but something wrong with me. Even as I say this, frustrated feelings still wash over me at this manipulative, guilt-ridden theology. So why didn't I walk away? Because my whole identity rested in that tradition. Family, friends, social networks. It meant walking away from all that as well, and I loved and respected my family dearly. It was easier just to believe that I was wrong. William James wrote a wonderful book in 1902, using psychology to talk about religion. He argued that different types of people look for and need different things from religion. One type simply doesn't fit all. The tragedy is that many people only experience one type, and they struggle to fit themselves into it. My 50 years since university days have been a gradual, often bumpy unravelling of my childhood beliefs. Eventually, I went back to university in my 40s to do religious studies in a secular environment where I was forced to explore outside the boundaries of religious traditions. I'm thankful now for all those assignments that came back with comments like, "Val, your Protestant petticoat is showing." Reading through my writings over the years, I see that petticoat retreating further and further. When Malcolm Muggeridge was asked about books that he wrote earlier in his life journey that are still in print, he wasn't concerned, as he said, "A book takes on a life of its own, independent of its author. And there will always be readers at those stages of life who find it helpful." To reflect on this present stage of life, I've been doing some reading on ageing. Now, those of you under 60 can start checking your phones now, as you probably haven't even thought about ageing. Richard Rohr, in his book Falling Upwards, describes two halves of life. In the first half, the big concerns are identity, security, and sexuality and gender. They preoccupy and often overwhelm us. Our institutions and expectations, including our churches, he says, are almost entirely configured to encourage, support, reward, and validate the tasks of the first half of life. The second half of life contains the reality of ageing, but for Rohr, it was also metaphorically a move into deeper reflection. He says the first half of life is writing the text, and the second half is writing the commentary on the text. This metaphorical second stage of deeper reflection can happen at any time, at youth, middle age, or even later, but Rohr thinks most people are simply happy to stay in the first half of life, with its, quote, never broken, always applicable rules and patterns that allow us to predict and control things. It takes necessary work to move into the deeper stage of life. Carl Jung put it this way: one cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be of little importance in the evening, and what in the morning was true will in the evening have become a lie. But Rohr writes as a healthy 78-year-old contemplative priest whose life work has been moving into this deeper stage of life. But that's not possible for everyone. Brynolf Lyon's book, Towards a Practical Theology of Aging, looks more at the reality for many older people. He identifies different descriptions of old age in the Christian tradition. The dominant one, seeing old age as a blessing, a reward for a life well lived. But what of those who didn't live well? And what of bodily deterioration? Hardly a blessing for many. Another biblical description falls back on the old dualism of mind as superior to body. As the body decays, the mind becomes richer and wiser, yearning towards God, something I think Rohr also thinks. But what if bodily decay has overwhelmed brain functioning? My sister's Alzheimer's began in her late 60s. Now at 80, in care and unable to communicate, we don't know what she hears or sees or understands. What of her deeper reflection on life with age? Such dualistic thinking is challenged today. We are whole people, not simply able to move into our minds when the body fails. In author Oliver Sacks' book called Gratitude, which are essays he wrote celebrating his 80th, Sacks eulogizes the famous scientist Francis Crick, who continued his research even after a terminal cancer diagnosis and was fully engaged in this when he died. Now, while Crick was an amazing scientist, this also sounds to me a bit like an example of privileged ableism, not possible for many people. With an established uninterrupted career and enough fame and tenure not to be trundled off at 65 or 70, Crick also lived with his brain cells and bodily functions fairly intact to the end. Oliver Sacks' essays on turning 80 are celebratory and describe both his father's and his own positive experiences. He says, being 80 is not a shrinking, but an enlargement of mental life and perspective. One has had a long experience of life, not only one's own life, but others' lives. One is more conscious of transience and perhaps of beauty. One can take a long view and have a vivid lived sense of history, not possible at a younger age. A time of leisure and freedom from the factious urgencies of earlier days, free to explore whatever I wish and to bind the thoughts and feelings of a lifetime together. Sacks' final two essays, however, were written after his terminal cancer diagnosis. He says, I am now face to face with dying, but I'm not finished living. Abruptly, his celebration changes to urgency. It's now up to me to choose how to live out the months remaining to me. I have to live in the richest, deepest, and most productive way I can. He can no longer be distracted, he says, by unessential things. This is not indifference, but detachment, he writes. I still care very deeply about the Middle East, about global warming, about growing inequality, but these are no longer my business. They belong to the future. Interestingly for me, Sachs describes this dramatic reversal as suddenly, quote, seeing his life as from a great altitude, a sort of landscape. Now, I've used this metaphor of landscape for life many times. We can live life as if standing on a hill, looking down at the world as if it were a distant picture before us, or we can live life within the rough and tumble of the picture, a throbbing part of it, affecting it and affected by it. Most of us have lived our first half of life in the middle of things, church, professions, neighbourhoods, families. But as Sachs experienced when dying, and others experience at retirement or the family dispersing, we move from these centres of activity, or are pushed by infirmity or just plain cultural assumptions about age. For some, this move to the landscape view is a joyous thing, to step back, relax and reflect from a distance. But for others, it can feel like rejection, especially for those who have been central in their professions or lived only for their work. A few clergy people on my Facebook feed have recently retired. For a while they post pictures of some new hobbies, of travel, enjoying nature, playing with the grandchildren, but then some senses a bit of frustration. Having been an authority on everything for a lifetime, preparing weekly sermons, interpreting scripture for the laity, making powerful decisions in synods, and writing opinion pieces in magazines, they feel they have lost their voice when it is still powerfully alive within themselves. They've been discarded. People no longer ask them to speak at functions, and decisions are made by people younger than their children, who they feel might be too liberal or too conservative, or are moving in directions already tried by them and found wanting. They're not prepared enough to say, like Sachs, I rejoice when I meet gifted young people. I feel the future is in good hands. Because unlike Sachs, they are not dying, and their brain continues its lifelong pattern of churning out reflections on everything, yet now without an audience. I say clergy persons because I'm leading into a new topic of church, but this is true for many men and women who at 65 or 70 must suddenly cease full-time involvement in something they care about, often without adequate preparation. So this leads me to churches. Now, while your church may be an exception, churches overall are dying, for reasons being analysed ad infinitum. The overwhelming majority of people still in the pews are over 70. Even progressive groups sport a sea of grey hair and shiny baldness. Yet every synod report, every assembly 5-year plan, lists as a top priority attracting the young people and more diversity. Now, I understand this cause perfectly, but this constant priority on who are not in the church and on new fancy programs and worship styles that might attract them completely ignores the well-being of those who are actually sitting in the pews in their second stage of life. It is as if, by acknowledging the presence of so many faithful oldies, we are acknowledging the church's inevitable demise. When did you last hear a sermon preached on how to cope with this elder stage of disenfranchisement, of illness, loneliness, and loss? Or read of a synod program offering a theology of ageing? The continual focus of synods and presbyteries on how to attract people not in the church, believing this is going to turn everything around, simply takes for granted the oldies, labouring long beyond their 70 years to hold up local churches, particularly in rural areas and often without clergy support. These oldies are also caring for spouses with dementia, coping with financial struggles, living separated from their families and experiencing the loss of friends, which Sachs has described as an abruption, a tearing away of part of myself. And how are synods helping our retired clergy, feeling discarded and ignored by the youngies who have taken their place? And what of the future of the church? Now, I think we have to separate out church as institution and church as local community. I am more and more disenchanted with church as institution. Historically, they have been places of power, of control, and inevitably of corruption. Throughout history, people have rebelled and formed new models more accurately reproducing early Christian communities, but these inevitably drift back into structures of power, control, open to corruption. Now, this is harsh, I know, and I may not have said it in my first stage of life. But even as we speak, another report has surfaced of over 3,000 pedophile priests protected in the French Catholic Church since the 1950s. And this is only the tip, again, of the horrific iceberg of sexual abuse within church institutions. Current divisive politics around abortion and same-sex marriage stem from what church institutions tell us God thinks. Evangelical megachurches with their prosperity gospels and slick, wealthy leaders are falling as quickly as they rise in financial and sexual scandals. The horrific history of the treatment of women by churches still invades its institutions who claim that the Bible tells us so. And domestic violence has been shown for some reason to be more prevalent in clergy families. Even if we think this doesn't apply to our particular institutional church, the structures still give often unchecked power to some and not others, and as the denominations shrink in size and wealth, this power lies in fewer and fewer hands, a power that includes our theology. The question of ordination comes into this. I wrote my PhD thesis in the 90s on the right of ordination in the Uniting Church. I traced the history of ordination in the merged church back to Calvin and Wesley, and then forward to show how the meaning and power of this rite of ordination has evolved. No matter how much we try, this rite is not something spelled out in Scripture. In Roman Catholic tradition, ordination ontologically changes the priest, making him forever different from the laity. The priests are the church, answerable to their peers, not the laity. Variations of the priestly rights, boundaries, and privileges came into Protestant traditions, evolving as circumstances and theology changed. I remember a United Church assembly in the 90s that argued theologically with great power against lay people presiding on the sacraments. But today, with fewer churches able to afford even part-time clergy, it's suddenly theologically sound for lay people to preside. I was also involved in defending women in a clergy sexual misconduct case in our American church, and was on the pastor parish committee responsible for handling any issues between clergy and congregation. But the matter was simply taken out of our hands and swept into institutional secrecy, so the pastor could be judged only by his clergy peers. Now, I have many wonderful clergy friends who are amazing leaders of congregation. So this isn't an attack on them as people, nor is it to say that we don't need leadership and theological expertise. I am simply calling for a long overdue, radical examination of church institutional structures and the power it claims over people's lives and faith. What does ordination now mean when we have clergy working as social workers and social workers who are lay pastors? As for worship, with Zoom through COVID, many people have talked about how this could change the way we do church in the future. But it seems to me from the churches I follow on Facebook that once the possibility of opening became real, all focus simply returned to the old worship models. The church as institution has done wonderful things through history and around the world. Hospitals, education, social structures, etc. But it has also fought wars, persecuted heretics, and colonized much of the world, often against its will. I think it's time to stop justifying its good over its evil, as if the evil is of no consequence, and take a harder look at how we have strayed from the way of Jesus with our structures. We have an option now to proactively do this, not just by restructuring and patching with more sandbags as the church shrinks and crumbles around us. This doesn't mean the end of Christianity as such, but a dramatic, drastic reimagining of what following the way of Jesus could mean today. How to move forward with backpacks on our backs, not basilicas, as Matthew Fox says. The local church is a different kettle of fish to the institution. There, many people find community, security, and love as a focus for their lives. Local churches are usually not as much about denominational belonging, but a sense of local identity, built up over years of being together, and this is precious. But, always the devil's advocate, this is not everyone's experience. We are a mobile generation today, and people needing to join a new local church may not find community if the church is not willing to embrace them. The biblical verse, "How those Christians love each other," does not hold in every church setting. For small churches with part-time or no clergy, organising worship, doing church repairs, and reporting to presbytery absorbs all their energy and resources. They simply become people of a building. Look at any church budget and see how much is spent on buildings, administration, staff, presbytery dues, and investments. Doing Sunday worship is the priority if resources are short, because it proves to the local church that it is still alive and well to its members and to the world. Little time, energy, and resources remain then to be active in the world. And members who are active in the world but don't attend Sunday worship are often frowned on or made to feel inadequate Christians, even though the gospel tells us more about what Jesus did in the world than what he did in the synagogue. Many progressives have found local churches uncomfortable places because they have questioned past beliefs, often putting themselves at odds with friends and families who don't want to make such a move. Richard Rohr says, "Be prepared when your old groups, your friendships, and even churches no longer fully speak to you the way they used to." As clergy come and go with different theologies and visions, some progressives have soldiered on in their local churches for the sake of community, but others need or are forced to leave and find communities with those who have moved in similar directions. Finding such like-minded people, however, is dependent on living in a big enough city, where such people can be found at close distances. As someone living in a small town, this isn't always possible, which is why I challenge progressive groups in larger cities to continue Zooming long after COVID to offer community for those in isolation. The big question, of course, is always God. It was so neat and tidy a few hundred years ago when the church told us who God is, and we would be charged with heresy if we thought otherwise. But with Hubble telescopes and flights into space, that God has become too small, as J.B. Phillips famously told us in the 60s. According to author Barbara Brown Taylor, reading a little cosmology now and then is a good corrective for those of us who speak too easily of God. If we really believe the one whom we worship is the creator of heaven and earth, then where do we get the nerve to offer tidy explanations about exactly who that one is and exactly how that one acts? In my book, Like Catching Water in a Net, Human Attempts to Describe the Divine, I examined all sorts of God images, but finished off by saying, such a book might be expected to end with a confident yes about God, to make us all feel secure. The once I was blind, but now I see conclusion. My experience and what I hear from the many who talk to me tells me, though, to believe more in the journey and the questions, and not always knowing where one is headed, but going anyway because of who we are. The question is, I asked, can you live with that? 14 years later, I'm still trying to live with that. People ask me, do you believe in God? But that's a non-question, because there are so many side questions involved, which the asker wanting a yes and no answer simply has no time to hear. What do you mean by God? What do you mean by believe? Is your question about some tangible proof or about faith or experience? I have long moved from the male, human-like God out there, interfering in the world at will. I've also moved from Jesus as God to Jesus as a God-intoxicated human sage, his death the inevitable consequence of standing against both Jewish and Roman authorities. I see his history embellished and glorified by an emerging Greek-oriented institutional church who, having constructed this divine human image, then claimed to speak for both Jesus and God. I must move beyond the word God, so full of baggage and failed theologies. I find comfort in the word mystery, the I am what I am of Judaism that inspired Jesus. Jesus spoke more of where mystery is, the realm of God, as opposed to the realm of the Roman Empire, rather than who this God is. For me, this realm is our ever-expanding universe, with God, energy, mystery already in our midst, within everything. Albert Einstein so beautifully said, "The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science. A knowledge of the existence of something we cannot penetrate, of the manifestations of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty. Enough for me, the mystery of the eternity of life and the inkling of the marvellous structure of reality, together with a single-hearted endeavour to comprehend a portion, be it ever so tiny, of the reason that manifests itself in nature." Mystery implies both the inability to comprehend, but also the inability to prove it. So it leaves it at mystery. Unknowable mystery within everything challenges the God images of my childhood, as well as talk of conversion, of accepting Jesus as Saviour in order to be in God's flock. We are already within the mystery, participating in it. There is nothing to join. I return to my beginning comment about being long infused with certain doctrines that never stop lurking in the back of the mind, and these are regularly regurgitated in hymns, Bible readings, religious imagery, and even in the term Christian. There is such a disconnect between the traditional Christian doctrine and imagery, still in the fore in our churches, and the imagery of being one with and within a changing, amazing universe, infused by a mysterious energy that we can only imagine by faith, not by proof. As Sally McFaig says, "I believe that one of the most profound religious emotions is wonder at and gratitude for life in all its incredible shapes, colours and sizes. It is about being, not doing or believing. And sometimes I still have to pinch myself to remind me to simply relax into that mystery and not feel the need to do something to be a good Christian, whatever that means, as if I am somehow outside and need to be in. How should we then live? Like many who write, I carry a notebook to jot down any thoughts I might have that would come in handy. The following came from a fundraising talk, encouraging donors to give by finding their passions and interests. The speaker quoted Frederick Buechner, a famous theologian for many of us, who said that we need to welcome people into, quote, more generous and humane images of vocation, as the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I'll repeat that. The place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. A donor will experience deep gratitude and deep gladness when her giving meets a deep hunger that stirs her passion. The speaker continued, I suppose all of us are trying to make deep gladness happen in our lives in some way or other. I know I am. Deep gladness. What rich words to describe life. I've thought of similar words like joy, but joy can also suggest a jolliness. Fake joy, to use Trump's terminology. Deep gladness reaches beyond the world of public smiles and enthusiastic Facebook pages. Deep gladness is in our very being, our very ground of being, where it meets in this depth with the mystery, Tillich's ground of being, with which we conspire. Conspire, that means breathe with. For me, this second half of life, both in age and also in reflection, is about learning to live in the present, rather than in the past of what might or was, or in the future of what might or might not happen. It is to enjoy the moment, stepping out, as it were, from historical linear time to be fully immersed in the now. This is hard to do in your first half of life, when everything was geared to the next step. Bishop Jack Spong, whose death we have recently mourned, wrote when he turned 80. Frequently, the joy of life is not fully appreciated until the years begin to creep up. When I was a young man, my focus was always on the future. I worked hard at each stage of my life to prepare for the next. There came a time, however, when I realised that I was not preparing for life, I was living it. The present became increasingly where I wanted to live, not the future. Meaning was found, life was lived, relationships were treasured in the present. My family became more and more important to me. Faith became existential, not theoretical. God became a living presence, not an external being. Christ became a principle lived fully in history by Jesus of Nazareth. Christianity became a universal experience that crossed boundaries. Staying connected with old friends became an increasingly precious part of life. Repairing broken relationships where possible became a priority, and where it was not possible, it helped simply to acknowledge my part in the brokenness. End of quote. Whatever age, whether still employed, retired, aging, or even facing illness or death, is the time to ask, what is life within the mystery for me at my present stage? By intentionally thinking about this, we may better deal with the struggles and longings of who we are not. We can take account of life, write a memoir in our minds or put it on paper of the road we've travelled and continue to travel. The famous Chilean author Isabel Allende, moving into her later years, says, I have lived in a rough sea where waves would lift me and then drop me to the bottom. This surge has been so strong that before, when things went well, I would prepare for the violent fall which I considered inevitable. instead of relaxing into the tranquility of the moment. Now it's not like this. Now I drift along day by day, happy just to float for as long as possible. So endeth my reflection. There are many things I didn't touch on. Perhaps it needs a book. You may have expected me to talk about what we should do, about climate change, about poverty, about racism, etc. But you already know the problems and what to do. I wanted more to explore who we are, with the hope that something might trigger your imagination for future exploration and thought. I'm going to finish with Oliver Sacks. As he faced his terminal illness, he wrote, "I find my thoughts increasingly not on the supernatural or the spiritual, but on what is meant by living a good and worthwhile life, achieving a sense of peace within oneself, that one's work is done and one may, in good conscience, rest. My predominant feeling is one of gratitude. I have loved and been loved. I have been given much and I have given something in return. I have read and travelled and thought and written. But above all, I have been a sentient being, a thinking animal on this beautiful planet, and that in itself has been an enormous privilege and adventure." Thank you.